Let's start with that big headline of the day, which is Pat Gelsinger stepping down as Intel CEO effective immediately. The CFO and Intel product CEO MJ Holthouse will be taking over as co-CEOs in the interim. Now, the news has Intel shares up a little less than 4% right now, but look, they're around $25 right now. What will it mean for the company's turnaround efforts more broadly and for the U.S. Interests in it as well? For more on this, we turn to our very own John Fortt, who's here on set with me, along with Truist analyst William Stein, and it's great to have you both in the house. John, let's just start with you and kind of rewind the script a little. It's my understanding when they brought Pat in, it was a bit of cajoling to get him in place, was it not? And it was already with this sense that he needed to lead this massive turnaround for the company. What happened and why did that fizzle out?
4 years ago, right around this time, Intel's board reached out to get him to join the board, and he was looking at that, got clearance from Michael Dell because he was the CEO of VMware, which is under Dell.
Wow.
And then they asked him, actually, would you be CEO? And he laid out his plan for, if I'm going to do this, here's how I'm going to do it. And the board said, okay. Now, if we look 4 years later, a lot of that plan was directionally correct. We do need leading edge domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Look at this big AI boom. There was question about that in the beginning. But Intel invested so much in it and this foundry strategy, the billions upon billions of dollars in capital commitments, while that main design business was, folding in on itself because of competition from NVIDIA and AMD. Intel hadn't properly prepared for this AI revolution, so they didn't have enough in the bank account to pay for all of those capital projects.
So if you had to boil it down, what would you say that Gelsinger's pitch was, his core plan was when he took over?
He was trying to bring back Intel as it was. And maybe that just wasn't possible based on current conditions. And NVIDIA's surged ahead way faster than a lot of people, even at NVIDIA, probably expected. So now, do you continue with that plan? It seems likely that they don't continue exactly with that plan, but we still need the domestic chip manufacturing.
Right.
Can they figure out a way to fund that outside of Intel's core business? And Intel's core business is still really important to PC chips and to data centers. So you got to have that, too. How do you work it all out?
No, I think that's exactly right. So, Will, we turn to you and say, OK, if this were just, I'm trying to think of a company that wouldn't quite matter as much to the American public, but the reason that we all care is because if all of the semiconductors critical to everything we're doing on the technological leading edge are manufactured in Taiwan or involve Taiwanese companies or are not fully and wholly owned and operated by the U.S., we can understand the risks in the supply chain, especially after what we've seen with COVID and all the rest of it. So what do we do then with a company that can't quite live up to the needs in order to meet those goals? And what options are there really for Intel at this point?
Yeah, I think one of the more obvious ways to address this is to say, well, you, Intel, don't need to necessarily be the one to do this anymore.
Right.
There are significant problems at this company. They're not rooted in the CEO. And they're longstanding. This is not the first CEO to have delivered results for Intel that were underwhelming relative to either semis or the S&P for that matter. All 5 of the last 5 CEOs did that. So I don't think Pat stands out in that way. There are ways that the company could potentially split into 2 and have a products business on the one hand and have a manufacturing or let's call it a foundry business on the other hand. This is not simple. This has lots of risks, but that's the general direction that many investors have discussed over the last few years and what we think some employees have advocated in the past that sort of lost out in that argument when Mr. Gelsinger came in.
A couple of questions, Will. What was the significance of this announcement last week that the Intel was going to receive less than initially thought from the U.S. government? And now it was only $500 billion, $600 billion, something like, no, I'm getting the math wrong, 600 million.
Yeah.
So yet it seemed to tell us something significant. What was that telling us a week ahead of his departure? And why was this departure so poorly thought out, it seems? I mean, maybe it wasn't poorly thought out, but there was not an obvious sense of, OK, this is weeks in the making. There's a clear succession plan and a direction for the company. I mean, at least from the analyst community, a lot of people seem to say this was not that smooth, all things considered.
Well, clearly, when they announced on December 2nd that as of December 1st, the CEO is gone, some things happened pretty abruptly and perhaps in a way that wasn't really planned. So let's start with that. What could have happened or caused it? Was it the smaller funding from the CHIPS Act? Perhaps. I really don't know. But certainly, what I would suggest is that there is a lack of conviction, certainly among customers, that Intel is going to be successful in foundry. That lack of conviction is maybe less pronounced today than it was a couple of years ago. Back then, I think it was more of a joke than a reality. Today,
Right.
we're closer to reality, but we're still not there. And one might look at, a smaller funding from the CHIPS Act and conclude that perhaps even the government doesn't think that, they can do what they want to do,
Sure.
which would be a fairly damning assessment.
Two quick final questions for each of you. And John, first to you. So, the questions about what to do with foundry or the essence of Intel, if they were to say, well, we're just going to do what we're really good at still doing, would be what exactly? What would they be left with?
They're really good at both things, actually. With all the mistakes that Intel has made, it's like when you're traveling home from Thanksgiving and you should have taken the local roads because there's a big accident, but you stay on the main road. Right? They made that mistake. They didn't do EUV when they should have. They kind of screwed up their manufacturing process. But still, when it comes to domestic manufacturing of a really important product, they're really good.
It is still a really important product, or is it something
Chips,
but I mean,
in
the kind of
general
chips
are
that go
really
into, desktop computers and data centers, but not the most cutting edge data centers?
But they do cutting edge chip design. They just fell a bit behind on that. So I don't think the question is, can they be pretty good? It's clear at this point that they can be pretty good. The question is, can they be the best? And where are the tens of billions of dollars that they need to do that going to come from when that core business isn't in position to fund that? Can they get it from customers? Can they get it from the government? Doesn't look as likely. Like, where's that money going to come from? And that core business of designing chips, they're pretty good at that, too. Most of the computers getting used are still working with Intel chips. So in the balance somewhere, you got to figure out how patient are you willing to be? Is there money that's willing to come in and fund that?
Yeah. And I guess, Will, then my last question to you would be, what would be the quickest way to get the stock to $50?
Well, the quickest way would be, some outside action, like a buyout by another company, either a private equity or a strategic buyer. I don't think either of those is very likely, but that would be the quickest way. I think more likely, these two companies are likely to split. And I want to tip my hat to an investor who suggested what I think is a great idea, but sort of out of Intel's, at least out of their full control, which is a path forward for this foundry business that could stand alone without the commitment of just Intel, would be to have a consortium of Western device companies commit both capital and orders to this as a foundry. That would be, I think, the best thing they could potentially achieve.
I mean, still, because consortiums, it all makes me a bit nervous. But I take your point that at least it would be a coming together, a capital commitment and a client commitment to an important
they're
unit.
spending on AI infrastructure as it is anyway, right? So the question is, do they want to protect from this geopolitical situation and do it that way? It's not out of the realm of possibility.
And just a quick coda on this. I mean, we have seen, John, TSMC and others trying to open factories so that more of that production is here. And I don't know if that allays any of the concerns on some level that we need this manufacturing here in the U.S.
Depends on how a Trump administration and those after feel about foreign ownership of those domestic assets.
Right. You and I sound like we got the same cold last weekend, by the way.
Yeah.
Battling through. John, thanks. Appreciate it. John Fortt and Will Stein. Really appreciate you joining us, Will.